The human ship drifted quietly through the dark stretch of space. Stars flashed by like tiny sparks, and the silence of the void pressed against its metal walls. Inside, Captain Elias Mercer checked the controls with practiced hands. He was the only one left on the small vessel, the others having been lost in a skirmish near the edge of the Zeoth sector. Elias knew humans were considered weak across the galaxy, fragile creatures meant to be ignored. But he had always believed that size and strength did not define power, cleverness did. The sensors beeped suddenly, a sharp, urgent sound that made Elias tense. He leaned forward, scanning the readouts. A massive shadow had appeared on the edge of the detection field. The shape was unlike anything he had ever seen. Sleek and angular, it moved with an eerie precision, and the energy signature screamed one thing: Zeoth warship. Elias knew that once they were detected, escape would be nearly impossible. These aliens were known for their efficiency, their merciless nature, and their ability to take prisoners for experiments rather than execution. He had heard stories of humans taken by them and never returned. Before he could plot an evasive course, the ship shook violently. Warning alarms blared. Elias gripped the control console, fighting to keep the vessel steady as a beam of energy struck its hull. Sparks flew and the lights flickered. The Zeoth ship was fast, much faster than his human vessel. There was no way to outrun it. He realized that the only option left was to surrender, to let them take him and hope to survive. The docking clamp of the Zeoth vessel attached with a mechanical hiss, and the human ship was pulled into the alien hold. Elias braced himself, heart pounding, as he was escorted by the Zeoth guards. They were taller than humans, with elongated limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Their eyes were large, dark, and unblinking. They moved with precision, no hesitation, and their expressions gave nothing away. To them, Elias was nothing more than a curiosity, a tiny creature to study. He was placed in a chamber that looked more like a research lab than a prison. The walls were smooth metal with strange symbols glowing faintly. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through his bones. There were devices he did not recognize, instruments for measurements he could not understand. And yet he felt a spark of determination. He had survived worse. Humans were built to adapt, to find solutions even in impossible situations. If they wanted a captive, he would be a clever one. The Zeoth observed him silently at first. They spoke among themselves in a language of clicks and hums that made Elias' head spin. One of them, taller and more adorned than the others, approached. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful, and it examined him with intense curiosity. Elias noticed that it leaned slightly forward, watching his every gesture. He did not flinch. Instead, he stood tall, even though his mind raced. If they thought humans were weak, he would show them that appearances could be deceiving. Days passed. The Zeoth conducted tests, measuring his strength, speed, and reflexes. They prodded him with strange devices and asked questions through a translator. Other humans, he discovered, had been taken before, and most had not survived. Elias refused to show fear. Every time they measured his strength, he responded with controlled movements, giving them just enough to see but never revealing his full potential. Humans thrived in unpredictability. They thought they were evaluating him, but he was learning as much about them as they were about him. During one session, they introduced him to other alien captives. Elias observed quietly. Some were weak and submissive, others defiant but lacking real strategy. He saw how they failed to cooperate, how fear divided them, and he realized that this was his advantage. Humans were capable of thinking creatively, improvising, and working together when needed. He did not have to be the strongest, he had to be the cleverest, and cleverness often beat brute force. One night while the Zeoth slept, or at least rested, Elias explored the chamber cautiously. He noted the positions of cameras, the weak points in the barriers, and the paths the guards took. He did not plan escape, not yet. That would be foolish. But he filed away knowledge. He understood systems and patterns better than the aliens expected. Where they saw a captive, he saw a puzzle. Where they expected compliance, he saw an opportunity. It was in those quiet moments when no one watched that he began to see how human instinct could thrive even in the heart of an alien stronghold. Curiosity, he realized, was both a danger and a tool. The Zeoth had underestimated him because they had never faced someone like a human. He had no exoskeleton, no natural weapons, no extreme speed, but he had patience, observation, and ingenuity, and that, he thought with a small, private grin, was enough to begin turning the tide in his favor. The Zeoth did not notice the small changes at first. Elias began answering their questions with subtle cleverness, giving solutions they had not considered. He suggested adjustments in experiments that minimized risks but produced better results. They were intrigued, their large eyes narrowing in focus as they realized he could think differently. One of the younger Zeeth, not yet hardened by their culture, began to watch him with genuine curiosity. Elias caught it and made a mental note. Alliances, even small ones, could be valuable. Then came the first real test. The Zeeth called it a trial of adaptation. A simulated environment was created in the chamber, a holographic battlefield with obstacles and tasks. Other captives had failed. Elias observed carefully, noting the behavior of the alien observers and the patterns in the simulation. When it was his turn, he moved with cautious efficiency, using small, precise actions that the aliens did not anticipate. Where they expected speed, he used strategy. Where they expected brute force, he used leverage. Each step was calculated, and by the end, he had completed tasks they thought impossible for a human. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the tall Zeeth who oversaw the experiment stepped forward. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, but Elias noticed something else, a flicker of respect. He had done more than survive, he had demonstrated capability. For the first time, he realized that the narrative of humans being weak was not universal. In the right circumstances, the human mind could outshine physical power. And he would use that advantage, step by step, day by day. That night, lying in the small chamber he now called a cell, Elias thought of home. He thought of the human world that had trained him to survive, to improvise, to never give up. Across the galaxy, humans might be underestimated, mocked, even imprisoned. But in every challenge, in every impossible situation, there was a chance to shine. And he intended to take it. Not through violence, not through rage, but through the very tool that the Zeeth could not control, human ingenuity. As sleep came, he listened to the hum of the alien ship, the soft movements of the guards, and the faint blinking of lights on the walls. The universe was vast, and the humans were few. Yet in this small chamber, among beings who had thought themselves superior, Elias Mercer felt a spark of opportunity. One day, they would learn what it truly meant to underestimate a human. And he smiled quietly, knowing that the game had only just begun. Elias woke to the soft vibration of the ship, the hum of energy passing through the walls of his chamber. His mind was already awake, calculating, observing. The Zeeth had kept him alive not just to test his strength, but to watch his reactions, to see what he could do when faced with challenges that required more than brute force. He had realized something important. They did not understand humans. They assumed humans were predictable, limited, fragile. That was their first mistake. Breakfast, if it could be called that, arrived in a small compartment sliding from the wall. Elias examined the food carefully. The aliens did not know human taste, nor did they expect him to find the simple flavors unfamiliar. He ate slowly, savoring the moment, thinking about what the next day would bring. Adaptation, he had learned, was more than reacting, it was anticipating. And he was already planning his next move. The Zeeth came for him shortly after. They moved in a silent procession, their long limbs gliding across the metallic floor. Elias did not resist. He had learned that defiance alone achieved nothing. Instead, he observed them closely. Each alien moved with purpose, and their eyes, large and dark, flicked constantly to monitor him. One younger alien lagged slightly behind the others, glancing at him with something that might have been curiosity or doubt. Elias filed that observation away. They brought him to a large chamber unlike the small cells he had seen before. The walls were lined with strange instruments, and holographic projectors filled the room with light and moving shapes. This was the Zeeth trial chamber, a place where captives were tested in ways meant to push them beyond their limits. Today, they said, he would face the challenge of insight. Elias knew from their gestures and the way they spoke that this test was not about strength. It was about perception, understanding, and problem-solving. The first part of the test was simple in appearance, a series of complex puzzles projected in 3 dimensions. Other captives from various species had failed before, frustrated by the alien logic and the unfamiliar technology. Elias studied the holograms carefully, analyzing each connection, each movement. He realized quickly that the Zeeth had overlooked one thing: humans were flexible thinkers. While the other captives tried to force solutions, Elias stepped back and considered the patterns, the intentions behind the test. He moved his hands carefully, rotating shapes in the air, aligning connections in ways that the aliens had not predicted. A small crowd of Zeeth observers gathered, watching with unblinking eyes. The younger alien from before leaned forward, clearly fascinated. Elias noted it and allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Curiosity could be used, and even the smallest interest from an observer could become an advantage. When the first puzzles were completed, the chamber shifted. Holographic walls reconfigured into a new layout. This time it was a physical challenge combined with a mental one. Obstacles moved, paths shifted, and a timer projected itself above the floor. Other captives hesitated, frozen by the complexity. Elias did not. He moved steadily, observing the rhythm of the obstacles, finding patterns, adjusting his steps to match. Where brute strength could not help, careful timing and sharp observation succeeded. By the end of the trial, the Zeeth were murmuring among themselves. Elias had completed what no other captive had before. Some of the older observers seemed concerned, their movements sharp and deliberate. Others, including the younger alien, watched in quiet wonder. Elias realized that his presence was already beginning to affect them. He was no longer just a human captive. He was a puzzle they could not ignore. That evening, Elias was returned to his chamber. He sat quietly thinking. The day had been exhausting, but it had also been revealing. The Zeeth were intelligent, highly structured, and observant, but they lacked one thing humans had: the ability to improvise under pressure without fear of judgment. He could not rely on raw power. He could not rely on size. He could rely only on his mind, his instincts, and his ability to adapt. Over the next few days, Elias began small experiments. He observed the routines of the Zeeth, their patrols, the patterns in their testing, the ways they responded to stress and surprise. He noted which captives became fearful, which tried to rebel, and which simply accepted their fate. Every observation was data, and every piece of data gave him leverage. He began to anticipate the trials before they even started, solving puzzles faster, moving through physical challenges with careful precision, and subtly gaining the attention of the curious younger alien. One morning, the Zeeth brought him to a new room. It was a simulation chamber, larger than before, filled with projections of a battlefield. The instructions were simple: navigate the terrain, avoid dangers, and reach a specified point. Other captives had tried and failed repeatedly. Elias stepped into the field, carefully watching the projections. He noticed small flaws in the simulated terrain, subtle delays in movement, inconsistencies the Zeeth had not accounted for. Humans noticed details others overlooked, he thought, and he used them to his advantage. He moved through the simulation with efficiency and intelligence. He avoided traps, anticipated enemy movements, and reached the target point faster than any other species had before. The Zeeth observers were silent at first, then a low murmur passed through the chamber. The younger alien leaned closer, its eyes wide with admiration or perhaps disbelief. Elias understood then that influence could begin quietly. He did not need force to gain respect. He needed results. That night, as he rested, Elias considered the younger alien. It had been observing him closely, asking subtle questions and showing signs of genuine interest. He realized that respect among the Zeeth could be earned, even across species, by proving capability and intelligence. If he could gain even a small measure of trust, he could shape their perception of humans more broadly. One individual's curiosity could ripple through an entire society, and Elias knew that humans had always relied on cleverness to change minds and situations. The next day brought a surprise. The Zeeth announced that a small group of captives would be paired together for a collaborative exercise. Elias was assigned with 3 others, all alien species. The task was simple in description but difficult in practice. Move through a complex series of obstacles, working as a team to achieve a shared goal. Other groups had failed spectacularly, unable to cooperate across species. Elias smiled quietly. Humans excelled at collaboration. They adapted, they communicated, and they improvised. At first, his teammates hesitated, unsure how to respond. Elias took the lead, not with force, but with careful direction. He observed each alien's strength, their speed, their abilities, and assigned them tasks that matched. Where others might have forced compliance, he explained simply, clearly, and calmly. Slowly, the group began to move in harmony, each member anticipating the other's actions. Obstacles were overcome not by strength, but by coordination, by timing, by insight. The Zeeth observers watched in increasing amazement. The younger alien leaned forward, clearly fascinated by Elias' methods. It whispered to another, and soon a quiet discussion began among them. Elias realized that this was the first step in changing their perception of humans. He had not spoken of superiority. He had not demanded respect. He had simply done what humans do best: adapted, improvised, and succeeded where others failed. When the exercise concluded, Elia's team had completed the task flawlessly. Other groups were frustrated, unable to understand how a human had led the group to success. The murmurs among the Zeeth grew. The taller, older observers narrowed their eyes, but Elias noticed a flicker of uncertainty there too. Perhaps they had underestimated humans after all. That evening, Elias returned to his chamber and sat quietly thinking. He was still a captive, still far from home, still surrounded by beings that could end his life with a single motion. Yet he felt a growing confidence. Every test, every observation, every small success was a brick in a foundation he was building. Humans might appear weak, but they had one weapon the Zeeth could not predict: ingenuity. And in this place, far from Earth, that ingenuity was beginning to shine. He closed his eyes for a moment and allowed himself a brief smile. The younger alien's curiosity, the quiet respect he had earned from some observers, the results of the collaborative exercise, all of it pointed to one truth: humans were underestimated across the galaxy, and that underestimation would be their first mistake. As sleep came, Elias thought of tomorrow. There would be more tests, more challenges, more opportunities to observe, adapt, and influence. He was no longer just a human captive. He was becoming something more, a mind they could not control, a force they could not predict, and perhaps, one day, a reason for them to see humans as more than fragile creatures. The game had shifted. He was no longer simply surviving. He was learning, growing, and subtly beginning to lead. And across the vast, silent expanse of the Zeeth vessel, the first seeds of respect for humanity were quietly taking root. The alien fleet moved silently through the void, but a tension hung in the air. Elias had been observing their systems and routines for weeks, quietly learning how the Zeeth operated. He was no longer just a captive. He was an anomaly in their midst, a being that challenged every assumption they had about humans. Yet, despite the growing respect he had earned from a few observers, the majority still saw him as weak, fragile, and insignificant. Elias knew he could not rely on their recognition alone. The moment to act would come without warning, and when it did, he had to be ready. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the ship. The sensors beeped urgently, a pattern that Elias had memorized. Another fleet, Zeeth rivals, known for their aggressive raids, was approaching at high speed. The alarms blared, echoing through the corridors. The Zeeth scrambled, their disciplined efficiency on full display. Commands were shouted in clicks and hums, and every ship seemed to know its role instantly. Elias watched from his observation platform, noting the precision and speed of their response. He could have felt fear, but instead his mind raced with possibilities. The first wave of attack hit. Energy beams lanced through space, and ships shuddered under the impact. Elias leaned forward, studying the battle. The Zeeth were skilled warriors, but their strength lay in rigid coordination and reliance on patterns. That rigidity could be exploited. Where they expected direct responses, a human mind could see alternative paths. Elias' pulse quickened with anticipation. This was no longer just a test of observation. It was an opportunity to prove what humans could do when every advantage of perception and adaptation was used. As the battle intensified, an older Zeeth officer approached him. Its expression was unreadable, but the movement of its eyes betrayed concern. It gestured toward the command console, clearly signaling Elias to assist. He understood immediately. The fleet was struggling with the speed and unpredictability of the attackers, and the Zeeth needed someone to think outside their rigid strategies. Elias stepped forward, his fingers flying over controls he had studied but never fully used. The human's first action was simple: reorganize the fleet's defensive formations. The Zeeth had a traditional pattern, predictable and linear. Elias suggested adjustments using diagonal sweeps and unexpected flanking movements. The sensors picked up enemy ships approaching blind spots. The Zeeth commanders stared at him, hesitant. Could a human truly understand their fleet well enough to command a maneuver? They had no choice. They had to try. To their surprise, the formation held. Enemy ships were caught in zones they had not predicted, and their attacks became less coordinated. Small victories accumulated, and the humans' calm, precise commands made a tangible difference. Some of the younger Zeeth began to murmur among themselves, impressed by what they were witnessing. Elias noted the subtle shift. Respect, once rare, was spreading quietly among the ranks. Then came the critical moment. An enemy cruiser broke through the perimeter, heading straight for a key command vessel. Alarms blared, and the Zeeth officers reacted with speed, but their plan lacked creativity. Elias saw the opportunity. He quickly devised a diversion using smaller ships to create decoy signals, drawing the cruiser off course. The maneuver required split-second timing and coordination between multiple units. The older Zeeth hesitated. This was risky, unconventional. Elias ignored the doubt and gave precise instructions. The plan worked. The enemy cruiser was lured into a trap, its momentum used against it. Energy beams from multiple Zeeth ships converged, disabling it without destroying the vessel entirely. The observers were stunned. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction. The human mind had found a solution the rigid alien logic had missed. For the first time, the Zeeth could not attribute success to their training alone. They had to credit him. In the aftermath, Elias was summoned to the command deck. The taller Zeeth who had observed him from the beginning approached, its eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. It gestured toward the screens, showing him the results of the battle. The rival fleet had been repelled, largely thanks to his suggestions. Elias spoke carefully, explaining his reasoning, the patterns he had seen, and the minor adjustments that had made a critical difference. The Zeeth listened, unblinking, and for the first time one of them asked for clarification, not to test him but to learn. The younger alien, who had been observing for weeks, leaned closer. Elias realized that he was beginning to influence their thinking. He was no longer just a captive. He was an unexpected resource, a mind that offered solutions no Zeeth had imagined. In the following days, Elias continued to demonstrate his capabilities. He suggested improvements to fleet maneuvers, ways to optimize energy use, and minor adjustments in defensive formations. Each recommendation, implemented carefully, resulted in measurable improvements. The observers who had doubted him were forced to acknowledge that humans could think differently, and that different thinking had value. Elias felt a quiet thrill. Every step he took not only ensured his survival, but also planted the seeds of respect for his species. Elias also began subtle lessons for the younger Zeeth. During quiet moments, he would explain principles of strategy, of anticipating patterns, of improvising under pressure. He never boasted, never demanded recognition. Instead, he offered insight in a way that encouraged curiosity. Slowly, he noticed a small but significant change. Some of the younger aliens began to try his methods themselves, adjusting tactics and problem-solving with the flexibility he had shown. One evening, as the fleet drifted in a temporary calm after the battle, Elias sat in the observation chamber, studying the stars. He thought of Earth, of the world that had taught him resilience, creativity, and determination. Humans had always faced challenges greater than themselves, and yet they had survived. Now, millions of light years from home, he realized that humanity's greatest strength was not technology, nor size, nor raw power. It was the mind, the ability to adapt, to learn, to turn even captivity into advantage. A sudden alert broke his thoughts. Another simulation of a possible attack appeared on the screens. Elias studied it carefully. The patterns were more complex, the threats unpredictable. He noted weaknesses and proposed strategies that relied not on strength, but on intuition and adaptability. The Zeeth who had once doubted him now consulted him directly, asking his opinion on maneuvers and formations. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction. Influence, he knew, was more powerful than brute force. The shift among the Zeeth was subtle but unmistakable. Where there had been mockery and doubt, there was now consideration, sometimes even deference. Elias did not mistake this for trust. He was still a captive, and he still had to be careful. But he had changed the conversation. Humans were no longer simply fragile creatures to be dismissed. They were capable of cleverness, insight, and leadership. And Elias intended to demonstrate that capacity fully, step by step, as the opportunity arose. In the quiet hours, Elias reflected on the battles, the simulations, and the lessons learned. He realized that every day offered a new chance to demonstrate what humans could do, and every small success was a message to the Zeeth. Underestimate us at your peril. He also began to consider the bigger picture. One day, he might lead not just in simulations, not just in suggestions, but in decisive action that could shape events across the fleet. That day was not today, but it would come. Elias smiled faintly as he prepared for rest. The human mind had survived against stronger, faster, more technologically advanced species before. He had survived the capture, learned the ways of the Zeeth, and even influenced their decisions. The galaxy had underestimated humans, as it always did, and that underestimation would be their greatest mistake. As sleep overtook him, Elias allowed a thought to linger. The human spirit was not bound by fear or captivity. It thrived on challenge, on opportunity, and on the chance to turn disadvantage into triumph. Across the cold void of space, he felt a spark of hope and a quiet, unshakable certainty that humans had only just begun to show their true strength. And somewhere deep in the corridors of the alien fleet, a few Zeoth watched him with curiosity and growing respect, unaware that this human captive was already shaping the future in ways they could not yet imagine. The calm after the last battle was brief. Space was never quiet for long, and Elias knew it. He spent the first hours observing the Zeoth fleet, noting small inefficiencies in their routines and finding subtle ways to improve them. He did not speak unless asked, but when the younger Zeoth sought his advice, he offered insights carefully, showing them new ways to approach problems. He avoided arrogance, knowing that trust had to be earned, especially among a species that had always viewed humans as insignificant. Over the following days, Elias found himself in unexpected conversations. Some younger Zeoth officers approached him cautiously, asking questions about human tactics, how humans made decisions, and how they solved problems in unpredictable situations. Elias answered simply, without exaggeration, focusing on the principles rather than giving away secrets. The Zeoth absorbed the lessons eagerly. They had been taught for centuries that humans were fragile and weak, but the more they interacted with Elias, the more they began to question their own assumptions. One day, a high-ranking officer called him to the central chamber. The walls glowed with the soft light of holographic star maps, showing distant systems and fleets in motion. The officer spoke in clicks and hums, translated mechanically, and asked for Elias' input on a strategic issue. A rival fleet was advancing toward a mining colony under Zeoth control. The standard response would have been to send the largest warships and rely on brute force. Elias shook his head gently. Humans solved problems by seeing alternatives, by finding solutions that did not rely solely on raw strength. He suggested a plan that combined deception, subtle movements, and careful positioning. Smaller vessels would create false signals, drawing the enemy into areas where larger ships could act efficiently. Sensors would be used not just to detect, but to mislead, and the fleet could conserve energy while maximizing impact. The older Zeoth officers hesitated. This strategy was unconventional, not part of their training, and risked failure if anything went wrong. But they had no better option, and slowly they agreed to follow his instructions. The execution began immediately. Elias coordinated the smaller vessels, monitoring the enemy's response and adjusting in real time. His suggestions worked exactly as he predicted. The enemy fleet misinterpreted the movements, making mistakes that larger ships could exploit. The Zeoth commanders were impressed, not just by the success of the plan, but by the humans' calm, methodical approach. Elias had turned what could have been a brutal confrontation into an efficient victory, and without unnecessary destruction. Afterward, the high-ranking officer approached him quietly, nodding in acknowledgement. Elias realized that this was more than just recognition, it was trust. He had shown that humans were capable of understanding complex systems and making decisions that even the most experienced Zeoth officers could not predict. The younger Zeoth officers began to gather near him more frequently, asking questions and watching how he approached problems. A small group of observers had become informal allies, their curiosity and respect slowly growing into a quiet following. In the quiet moments between missions, Elias began building these connections further. He listened more than he spoke, asking questions about Zeoth culture, their priorities, and their limitations. By showing interest in them, he earned their confidence. The younger Zeoth began to confide small observations to him, sometimes questioning their own decisions or offering information that others might not have noticed. Elias absorbed it all. Knowledge was power, and he understood that influence came not from authority, but from insight. One day, a routine simulation revealed a critical flaw in the Zeoth defensive system. Without hesitation, Elias analyzed the patterns and proposed a solution. His suggestions were implemented immediately, preventing what could have been a catastrophic failure. The older officers could no longer dismiss him as a mere curiosity. Slowly, the perception of him shifted, from captive to contributor, from observer to problem solver. Elias recognized the subtle change and worked to strengthen it, careful not to push too quickly. Trust had to grow naturally. His influence grew in small ways. In meetings, he suggested improvements to communication protocols. During drills, he advised on resource allocation. The younger Zeeth officers began trying his strategies on their own, quietly implementing them in minor exercises. What started as curiosity became respect, and respect began to build confidence. Elias was no longer a passive participant in the Zeeth fleet. He was becoming a part of it, not by force, but by proving value and earning trust. The turning point came during a critical alert. A rogue faction within the Zeeth fleet had initiated an unsanctioned attack on a neutral colony. The main fleet was caught off guard, and confusion spread quickly. The older officers argued, each offering conflicting commands. Elias watched carefully, assessing the situation. He could see the weaknesses immediately, the delays in decision-making, the miscommunication, the rigid reliance on patterns that no longer applied. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, offering a plan to stabilize the fleet and neutralize the rogue faction efficiently. His proposal was unconventional, relying on speed, deception, and coordination among ships that were usually kept isolated. The older officers hesitated, unsure if they could trust the judgment of a human. But the younger Zeeth, who had observed Elias for weeks, stepped forward in support. Slowly, one by one, the others agreed. Elias took command, coordinating movements and issuing instructions through the officers. The fleet responded with precision. Within hours, the rogue faction was contained without unnecessary losses. After the incident, the Council of Zeeth elders summoned him. They acknowledged his contributions openly, something that had been unheard of for captives. The younger Zeeth officers remained by his side, their confidence in him clear. Elias realized that the trust he had earned was more than personal, it was becoming institutional. He had transformed from a captive to a figure whose insight was valued in critical decisions. Despite the growing respect, Elias remained cautious. He knew that the fleet could turn against him if they ever saw him as a threat rather than an asset. His advantage lay in subtlety, in showing capability without arrogance, in offering solutions without demanding power. He maintained a careful balance, cultivating trust while continuing to observe and learn. Influence, he understood, was a slow process, but once established, it could be more powerful than any weapon. In the evenings, Elias reflected on his progress. He had survived captivity, turned trials into opportunities, and begun to shape the perceptions of an entire species. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was vast, full of challenges that no single human or fleet could face alone. But he also knew that humans were capable of more than even the most advanced species expected. Patience, ingenuity, and resilience had brought him this far, and they would carry him further. The younger Zeeth, now clearly a friend and ally, approached him during one quiet moment. Its large eyes reflected curiosity and a newfound respect. Elias smiled faintly, knowing that influence often began with a single connection. Together, they discussed strategies, shared observations, and quietly planned improvements to the fleet's operations. Elias did not seek leadership openly, but he understood that guidance came in many forms. Sometimes the quietest voice could have the most profound effect. As the days passed, small changes spread throughout the fleet. Protocols adjusted subtly, communication improved, and exercises became more effective. The Zeeth began to see humans differently, not as fragile captives, but as beings capable of insight, creativity, and leadership. Elias continued to guide, to teach, and to influence, always carefully, always subtly. He had turned a position of weakness into one of quiet strength, and the respect he had earned was beginning to ripple through the ranks. One night, as he looked out over the glowing stars beyond the observation deck, Elias reflected on how far he had come. He had been taken as a captive, thought weak and insignificant, yet he had begun to reshape the perception of his entire species. Humans had always survived, not by sheer force, but by thinking differently, by adapting, by seeing opportunities where others saw limitations. That same ability had carried him through captivity, and it would continue to guide him. Elias allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had taken small steps, each one carefully calculated, and had begun to turn captivity into influence. The younger Zeeth officers were learning from him, the older ones were beginning to recognize his value, and the fleet itself was operating more efficiently because of his insights. He was no longer just a human captive. He was a subtle force within the Zeeth fleet, a mind they had underestimated, and that underestimation would continue to work in his favor. As sleep came, he allowed himself a thought that had grown stronger each day. Humans were not just survivors. Humans were thinkers, planners, and innovators, and even in the heart of alien space they could leave a mark. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that a human could be more than a captive. And Elias Mercer intended to make every moment count. Across the corridors of the Zeeth fleet, quiet observations were made, discussions whispered, and plans reconsidered. One human, thought weak and fragile, had begun to shape the thinking of an entire species. And the ripple of respect and influence he created would only grow stronger in the days to come. The fleet moved with quiet purpose, but the tension in the air was palpable. A new threat had appeared, one that none of the Zeeth had anticipated. An aggressive coalition of alien raiders from outside the system had been detected on the sensors, advancing quickly toward a cluster of unprotected colonies. The Zeeth, confident in their strength, began deploying ships in a predictable pattern, relying on brute force and traditional strategies. Elias, watching from the observation deck, frowned. Humans had always succeeded by noticing what others overlooked, by finding solutions where others relied only on power. This situation demanded exactly that kind of thinking. He moved quickly to the command consoles, analyzing the readings. The raiders were fast, their movements erratic but systematic. They were strong individually but disorganized in groups. The Zeeth fleet's usual formations would be unable to respond effectively. If the colonies were to be defended, the conventional approach would fail. Elias spoke clearly, calmly, suggesting a new strategy. Use smaller, more agile ships to confuse the raiders, lure them into zones where larger vessels could strike efficiently, and create traps that relied on the raiders' overconfidence against their own fleet. The older Zeeth officers hesitated, reluctant to follow a human's plan. But the younger officers who had observed Elias' previous successes and learned from him stepped forward in support. Slowly, the council agreed to implement his strategy, if only partially at first. Elias smiled faintly. Trust was often cautious, and he expected it. The human mind worked best when others underestimated it. The fleet moved as he instructed, and Elias coordinated their actions carefully. Smaller ships darted in and out, creating false signals that distracted the raiders. Larger vessels waited patiently in ambush zones, their energy weapons ready but unused until the perfect moment. Every movement was calculated, every action precise. Elias watched, anticipating enemy reactions and adjusting tactics in real time. The Zeeth officers around him followed orders without question, their earlier skepticism giving way to admiration. When the first wave of raiders entered the ambush zone, chaos erupted among the attackers. They were caught off guard, unable to adapt to the unexpected strategy. Energy beams struck at calculated points, disabling raider ships without destroying them unnecessarily. The Zeeth fleet moved efficiently, coordinating through subtle signals that only someone observing patterns differently could recognize. Elias felt a surge of satisfaction. This was more than just strategy. This was proof that human ingenuity could save lives and influence entire fleets. As the battle continued, Elias noticed a weak point in the enemy formation. He issued precise instructions to the Zeeth, redirecting ships to exploit the flaw. The raiders, confident in their speed and firepower, were unprepared for this sudden maneuver. One by one, their ships became trapped in zones where larger Zeeth vessels could immobilize them. The younger officers watched in awe, recognizing the cleverness of the human mind. For the first time, many of them realized that humans were not merely fragile creatures. They were capable of insight that even centuries of alien experience could not predict. By the time the final raider ship was contained, the fleet had successfully defended the colonies without unnecessary destruction. The Zeeth elders convened in the command chamber, and Elias was summoned. The officers spoke to him, not with the usual cold detachment, but with respect. They acknowledged his contributions openly, recognizing the value of his strategy and insight. The younger officers nodded eagerly, proud to have supported the human's plan. Elias realized that he had accomplished something extraordinary. He had turned distrust and skepticism into recognition and influence, all without raising his voice or threatening anyone. After the council meeting, Elias moved quietly through the corridors. He passed the younger Zeeth officers, who greeted him with subtle gestures of respect. Some whispered among themselves, discussing tactics they had learned from him and how they could apply them in future missions. Elias smiled faintly. Influence, he knew, was not about dominating others. It was about teaching, guiding, and proving value through action. He had taken the position of a captive and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate humanity's potential. In the days that followed, the Zeeth fleet implemented additional strategies inspired by Elia's insights. Communication improved, coordination between ships became more efficient, and officers who had once doubted him began consulting him directly. Even the older, more skeptical officers recognized that humans were capable of strategic thinking that rivaled the best-trained Zeeth commanders. Elias observed quietly, letting them take pride in their new efficiency while subtly shaping the way they approached problems. One afternoon, the younger Zeeth officer approached him privately. Its eyes reflected curiosity and respect. "We have learned much from you," it said through the translator. "Your approach changes the way we see humans." Elias nodded. "Humans survive by noticing what others miss and by adapting," he replied. "That is all. You have the choice to use that knowledge or ignore it. The results will show themselves." The Zeeth studied him thoughtfully, and Elias understood that this was more than flattery. It was the acknowledgement of equality, of insight recognized across species. A new alert came later that evening. A distant fleet was approaching, but this time Elias was ready. The Zeeth officers, who had once been skeptical, now turned to him for guidance. He analyzed the data, suggested maneuvers, and coordinated with officers of multiple ranks. The smaller ships were positioned to create confusion and misdirection, while the larger vessels waited to strike at the optimal moment. When the enemy arrived, they were caught in zones of tactical advantage they had not anticipated. Victory was decisive and efficient, achieved through planning, observation, and human insight rather than brute force. As the battle ended, the Zeeth elders convened once more. This time they spoke with openness and recognition. Elias was acknowledged as a valuable mind within the fleet, not merely a captive who had survived tests, but as a strategist whose insight had saved lives and shaped outcomes. The younger officers stood proudly beside him, and even the older ones, though reluctant to admit it openly, showed signs of respect. Elias realized that he had achieved something extraordinary. Humans, once dismissed across the galaxy, were now seen as capable, adaptable, and influential. Elias walked quietly through the corridors, reflecting on the journey. He had been captured, underestimated, and confined, yet he had turned every challenge into an opportunity. The human mind, adaptable and creative, had allowed him to survive, to influence, and ultimately to gain respect from one of the galaxy's most advanced species. He knew that this was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast, full of unknown threats and opportunities, and humans would continue to be underestimated. And every time they were, that underestimation would become their greatest weakness. That night he stood on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. The fleet moved in quiet harmony, a testament to the lessons learned and the subtle influence he had provided. Elias felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not in glory or power, but in proof that ingenuity, courage, and adaptation could overcome limitations that others imposed. Humans had always survived, and now, even in the heart of alien space, their potential had been recognized. The younger Zeeth approached him again, this time with a gesture of genuine camaraderie. They spoke quietly, discussing tactics, fleet movements, and ideas for the future. Elias smiled. Influence, he knew, was not about demanding recognition. It was about planting seeds that grew quietly, changing minds through example and action. The fleet was stronger because of collaboration, because of insight, and because of the recognition that a human mind could offer solutions others could not. As sleep came, Elias reflected on everything he had achieved. He had survived capture, adapted to alien systems, influenced decisions, and earned respect across a species that had once dismissed him. Humans were resilient, adaptable, and clever. He had proven that even a single human could change outcomes in ways that others could not predict. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and that underestimation had become the key to their advantage. In the coming days, Elias would continue to guide, to teach, and to observe. But he knew this. He was no longer a captive. He was a valued mind, a strategist, and a subtle leader. Across the Zeeth fleet, respect for humans had begun to grow, and with it, the understanding that they were capable of far more than any species had imagined. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the fleet lull him into rest. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a certainty that humans were not simply survivors. They were thinkers, innovators, and problem-solvers, capable of shaping events across the galaxy. And somewhere deep in the corridors of the fleet, the Zeeth whispered among themselves, acknowledging for the first time that humans were not weak, but extraordinary in their adaptability, resilience, and insight. The human captive had become something more. He had become proof that even the smallest species, underestimated and dismissed, could change the course of events across the stars. Elias Mercer had not only survived, he had shown that humanity's true strength was intelligence, adaptability, and the quiet power of never being underestimated. And across the galaxy, one message quietly spread, carried by observation, by whispers, and by the results of human ingenuity: never underestimate a human.